It's back. Purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 2157.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 357 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 2157. The Chair appoints the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Finkenauer.
I have to wait for her to read the title.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2157, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Lowy, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York.
Madam Chair, I yield myself such time as I may consume. Last year, we watched hurricanes pummel Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. Wildfires burned large swaths of the West. Typhoons strike territories in the Pacific. In addition to the tragic loss of life, families lost everything. Businesses were upended. Communities were ripped apart. That is why in January, the House passed an emergency disaster relief bill, H.R. 268, to help our fellow Americans recover and rebuild. Unfortunately, the bill languished for months in the Senate over assistance for Puerto Rico. And as I sat there, floods battered the Midwest and tornadoes swept the South, resulting in even more destruction. And it sat there in the Senate. This legislation attempts to meet the needs of all of America's disaster-stricken communities, whether in Puerto Rico or the Midwest, California or the Carolinas, with $17.2 billion in emergency spending. In addition to the funding provided in H.R. 268, the bill makes 3 critical additions. It includes $1.5 billion for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for repairs to Corps projects damaged by flooding and natural disasters. It provides $1 billion for community development block grant disaster recovery, with language ensuring it is spent quickly to help communities rebuild housing, businesses, and public infrastructure in the most impacted and distressed areas affected by major natural disasters. And it includes $500 million for the Department of Agriculture's Emergency Conservation Program, providing emergency funding and technical assistance to farmers and ranchers to rehabilitate farmland damaged by natural disasters. That's an additional $3 billion to address the urgent needs following the Midwest floods and southern tornadoes. An additional $3 billion to rebuild damaged infrastructure to help communities recover and to bring local economies back to life. American citizens are relying on our federal government to deliver a robust disaster relief package. They've waited long enough, and frankly, they can't afford to wait any longer. Further delays will only leave communities more vulnerable and exposed to future natural disasters. With Atlantic hurricane system beginning in just 4 weeks and looming summer heat increasing wildfire risk, we must act now. Madam Chair, this legislation is a critical and long overdue step to meeting our fellow citizens' urgent needs. I urge my colleagues to support it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Woman from New York reserves her time, and the gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 2157, the Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2019. This bill is similar to the disaster supplemental that passed the House in January. We've been waiting for the Senate to act on their version of the supplemental for several months. Unfortunately, taking up a disaster bill for the second time without addressing the administration's concerns will not increase its chance of becoming law. While this bill assists many communities struggling to recover from hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, and tornadoes, I have to oppose this measure today. I'm particularly concerned about repairs that are needed to severely damaged military installations. We must return these facilities to a condition that can support our men and women in uniform. Unfortunately, the needs are actually greater than what is funded in this bill. I'm also concerned about that the bill fails to address the humanitarian and security crisis at the border. The rule for this bill does not allow us to consider an amendment to provide humanitarian relief and enhance security at the border. On my recent visits to the border, I've seen firsthand that the crisis is getting worse every day. The numbers are staggering. In April alone, Customs and Border Patrol made 109,000 apprehensions on the southwest border. More than half of these were family units. There have been more apprehensions in the first 7 months of this fiscal year than in all of the last fiscal year. Resources are urgently needed to address the health and safety of our law enforcement personnel, as well as families with children who are seeking refuge. This bill does nothing to address this crisis. We have no choice but to work together on this issue. We do not have the luxury of waiting for months to get resources to law enforcement, social service providers, and public health officers. The time to act is now. I want to thank Chairwoman Lowy for her tireless work to address the needs of our nation. But as we work together to end the shutdown in February, we can come together again to rebuild our communities, protect our border, and provide humanitarian assistance where it is urgently needed. Unfortunately, I have to oppose this bill as it currently stands. I hope we can continue to work with the Senate and the White House to come up with a compromise and get disaster assistance to the communities that need it most. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves her time, and the gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, I am very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Ohio, the chairwoman of the Energy and Water Subcommittee, Ms. Capter.
The gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank Chairwoman Lowy for yielding and for Ranking Member Granger for bringing this bill to the floor and rise in strong support of H.R. 2157, the Supplemental Appropriations Act for 2019. Natural disasters across our nation have been devastating the lives of millions of Americans. This map shows just some of the areas and families that have been stricken and waited and waited and waited months for federal support. The Missouri-Mississippi River system are absolutely clogged from the Canadian border all the way down to the mouth at New Orleans. And the devastation is understood by Americans who watch the news. And we've waited months and months and months for federal support. And the failure for this body to act faster is shameful. So I welcome this moment this morning on behalf of all those who've been harmed. It is the top responsibility of Congress to provide these hard-hit communities with strength, hope, and support to recover. Imagine, looking out your window and seeing this in your backyard. That's happened to thousands and thousands of families. This supplemental will finally provide aid to these ailing people and communities damaged by hurricanes, typhoons, volcanic activities, tornadoes, floods, snowstorms, and wildfires. From our energy and water accounts, $2 billion is provided to fix damaged Army Corps projects, with an additional $1.5 billion in Army Corps funding for the devastation wreaked by the flooding in the Midwest. We are at a 125-year high in the amount of rainfall coming down between the Rockies and the Appalachians, 125-year high in this country. Many communities have been flooded like this one, but also we have very high water levels, even in the Great Lakes region, where land is just soaked and farmers are so concerned about what's going to happen, and business owners and homeowners. Many of these communities are still underwater, but here we provide an initial down payment. The bill also contains $775 million to accelerate projects to mitigate future disaster damages. The bill comprehensively aids devastated communities with nutrition and Medicaid assistance, crop and livestock aid to farmers, aid to upended rural populations. It rebuilds devastated military and Coast Guard installations so our service members can focus on protecting our national security. Imagine Camp Lejeune asking us for more help. It funds resiliency of our nation's drinking, wastewater, and electrical grid systems, and provides communities help to rebuild businesses and local public infrastructure. Importantly, it includes significant help to rebuild Puerto Rico, which suffered complete devastation from Hurricanes Irma and Maria. This is deeply personal to my constituents and to me. The president's refusal to recognize Puerto Ricans as the American citizens they are is unconscionable. The Senate Republicans back this position and find it reprehensible. Might I have an additional 15 seconds?
Yes, 15
I thank the gentlelady.
Recognized for an additional 15 seconds.
Thank you. This is the second time this House has voted on supplemental funding this year. It's time the Senate take up this legislation and give some peace to American communities and our citizens living in devastation. I urge swift passage of this act and yield back, and thank Chairwoman Lowy for the opportunity to
Gentlelady
speak.
yields back. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith.
The gentleman from Nebraska is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you for the time. Mr. Speaker, I rise to reflect on the importance of the disaster supplemental bill we are considering today. In Nebraska, we continue our work to recover from the storm which hit our state at the end of February. The storm brought with it blizzard conditions and large amounts of rain, followed rapidly by destructive flooding. The impact of this storm continues to be felt across our state, particularly by our ag producers. In the West, the extreme blizzard conditions compounded an already hard winter, leading to severe cattle losses. In the East, stored grain was actually washed away or damaged by the floods, and extensive silting of fields has impeded planting season as the season is now underway. I particularly appreciate both this bill and the most recent Senate package, including language to ensure our disaster programs can address losses of stored grain. While crop insurance covers producers from planting, including coverage for prevented planting up through harvest, it does not provide coverage for harvest grain, which is stored and has not yet been sold. Our producers need this relief. I realize this bill is not perfect, and there are a number of issues I hope we can address moving forward. I would prefer to be considering legislation which addresses the concerns of some senators and the president and would be signed into law. This bill does not, and I hope negotiations will get us there soon. I've long advocated for disaster packages to be paid for. This package is not, and my amendment to cover the cost was unfortunately not made in order. We have traditionally extended a number of tax relief provisions to families and businesses in disaster areas. I've introduced legislation to do this, and I hope we can act on this relief soon as well. Mr. Speaker, Nebraskans need relief. Considering this bill moves us closer to providing them relief, and for that reason, I do support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 3.5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, the chairman of the Transportation Subcommittee, Mr. Price.
Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 3.5 minutes.
I thank our chairman for yielding this time, and I rise in support of this disaster supplemental, which will provide $17.2 billion in long overdue assistance for North Carolina and for other states and territories that have suffered from devastating natural disasters. North Carolina has been hit by 2 hurricanes in as many years, with thousands of people displaced, homes destroyed, and livelihoods lost. Meanwhile, typhoons, tornadoes, wildfires have wreaked havoc on millions of Americans in the South, the Midwest, California, and several territories, including Puerto Rico. The bill before us ensures the federal government will remain an active partner in the recovery effort. It provides comprehensive resources for flexible community development block grants, highway and bridge repairs, Army Corps construction along our coasts and rivers, Department of Agriculture, crop and livestock relief, repairs to our military installations, and many other critical recovery activities. We all know that these resources are desperately needed. We all know that they should have been provided months ago. The House passed a similar package back in January that stalled in the Republican-controlled Senate. The president has complicated our efforts, to put it mildly, and he's complicated them in a particularly unfortunate way. He's obsessed with Puerto Rico. He's determined to punish the island for offenses real or imagined. This has stymied bipartisan and bicameral efforts to help all Americans recover, Puerto Ricans included. And now the president's latest move is to insist that this disaster recovery bill should become a vehicle for his border priorities. The administration is even holding back money that's already been appropriated, including nearly $16 billion in HUD community development block grants held up by the White House and OMB for political purposes. This has slowed the recovery, not just in Puerto Rico, but in my home state, North Carolina, in Florida, in Georgia, Texas, South Carolina, and the Virgin Islands. It's time for the president to stop playing politics with disaster funding, and it's time for Republicans in the House and Senate to show some backbone, to say to the White House, enough already, to join with Democrats to help communities in need. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from New York reserves. Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve my time.
Gentlewoman from Texas reserves. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I am pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Minnesota, the chair of the Interior Subcommittee, Ms. McCollum.
Gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in support of this funding package today, and I am pleased that within the Interior Subcommittee's jurisdiction, the bill provides more than $2 billion from recovery from devastating natural disasters. This includes $849 million to rebuild drinking water and waste treatment centers systems to a state of resiliency against future storms, and $50 million for coastal resiliency projects to reduce flooding and erosion caused by sea level rise and climate change. This bill provides funds to repair federal facilities that were destroyed or damaged, like the Hawaii Volcanoes Observatory, funds for historic preservation grants to repair culturally significant sites and properties, and funds to clean up hazardous and solid waste. A critical provision in this bill provides $720 million to fully repay the U.S. Forest Service for funds it was forced to borrow in the last fiscal year to cover the cost of wildland fire suppression. An additional $1.34 million will help the Forest Service to address damage to national forests and to treat hazardous fuel loads. This emergency funding in this bill will help Americans who are struggling to restore their lives, to return to their homes after devastating fires and hurricanes of last year's. Communities in all of our states and our territories deserve federal support as they recover from natural disasters. Democrats are proud under the leadership of Chair Lowy to be bringing this bill to the floor to help those who have suffered from these natural disasters to begin to rebuild and heal their lives. And I urge my colleagues to support this bill. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yield. And the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized. Woman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'm very pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, the chairwoman of the Military Construction Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, Ms. Wasserman Schultz.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. I rise in support of the underlying legislation. Madam Speaker, H.R. 2157 totals $17.3 billion in emergency disaster appropriations to provide relief and recovery assistance for Americans affected by recent hurricanes. The Milcon VA portion of the bill provides $860.4 million for Department of Defense military construction needs and the Department of Veterans Affairs. Specifically, the bill includes $115 million for the Marine Corps to begin planning for construction projects related to the devastation from Hurricanes Florence and Michael on Marine Corps facilities in North Carolina, New River, Cherry Point, and Lejeune. The Marine Corps is planning facility consolidation efforts resulting from the hurricane's damage, and this funding represents the first step in that rebuilding process. Madam Speaker, the bill also includes $700 million to begin rebuilding Tyndall Air Force Base in my home state of Florida. This funding will support the relocation of the F-22 mission, the bed down of F-35s, and the planning for construction of new facilities. This funding is a vital first step to begin the rebuild of Tyndall. Madam Speaker, I also want to point out that this funding for Tyndall and North Carolina is a down payment because Congress is going to need to provide much more than this to get these locations back up on their feet. Madam Speaker, these events happened 6 months ago, and yet the first supplemental request to be submitted by the administration is not to address natural disasters. It was for border needs. I'm astounded that the administration continues to ignore these real emergencies, which clearly should have been addressed months ago, and I'm proud that the Democratic majority is doing just that today. I urge all members of this body to cast a yes vote, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields, and the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Is my colleague prepared to close? We're waiting for speakers, but, I am very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from New York, the chairwoman of the Small Business Committee, Ms. Velasquez. Got here just in time.
The gentlewoman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes, for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of this legislation. And I want to thank the gentle lady from New York for yielding. It has now been 2 years since Maria battled into Puerto Rico, inflicting historic damage, enormous suffering, and the loss of 3,000 American lives. Yet, 20 months later, the people of the island continue struggling to recover and rebuild. Compounding this problem, Puerto Rico has exhausted funding for its nutritional assistance program, and the governor has informed us they require $600 million to meet the food needs of the Commonwealth's most vulnerable. These are seniors, working single mothers, and those with disability. Let me remind my friends, in the U.S. territory, Puerto Rico, 65% of our children live in poverty. It is un-American to deny nutrition assistance to American citizens living in Puerto Rico, particularly children. That is immoral, and we should be ashamed that in the richest country, most powerful country in the world, we are allowed for children to suffer this way. That is simply wrong. In January, we passed a package to address this, but the Senate has failed to act, even though a number of my Republican Senate colleagues have promised to deliver Puerto Rico the aid so desperately need. Making matters worse, our president has repeatedly distorted and misled the American people about the amount of money Puerto Rico receives. We must remember, Mr. Speaker, those suffering in Puerto Rico are our fellow citizens. It is unacceptable that this president and Senate Republicans will abandon them. Importantly, the bill also instructs FEMA to rebuild in a manner that is more resilient and capable of withstanding future extreme weather. Maria taught us painful lessons, and it only makes sense that the island recovers. We provided with the tools to rebuild, to resist future hurricane. Madam, 30 more seconds. Thank you.
The gentlewoman is recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I pray of this bill, which rightfully assists so many other parts of the union, of our nation, will motivate the Senate at last to act and the president to sign this badly needed aid into law. This is a matter of life and death for so many in Puerto Rico. I urge a yes vote and yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. From New York is recognized. The gentlewoman from New York reserves, and the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Close. To close, I would like to thank Chairwoman Lowy for her leadership. I look forward to working with her on legislation that addresses both natural disasters and the humanitarian crisis on the border. We should provide much-needed relief to communities recovering from hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and tornadoes, but we cannot turn our back on a border crisis that's growing worse by the day. Law enforcement and agencies providing humanitarian assistance are being rushed and pushed to the limit, and we must act now. The chairwoman and I have worked together for many years to find solutions in the national interest. I know we will be able to do so again. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back, and the gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Madam Chair, it is time to stop playing games and provide assistance to all Americans, no matter whether you lost your home to a wildfire in the West, farmland to flooding in the Midwest, or your entire community to a hurricane in Puerto Rico. Vote yes, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 11612, modified by the amendment printed in Part B of House Report 11651 shall be considered as adopted, and the bill as amended shall be considered as an original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No further amendment to the bill as amended is in order except those printed in Part C of House Report 11651. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall not be subjected to amendment, and shall not be subjected to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in Part C of the House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
As we work to rebuild from hurricanes, flooding, and other natural disasters through this supplemental appropriations bill, I'm glad the Appropriations Committee included funding to improve U.S. weather forecasting, modeling, and computing capabilities. Improving our forecasting abilities can save lives and protect property, which is exactly the mission charged to the National Weather Service. My amendment adds an additional $5 million for NOAA's weather forecasting, modeling, and cloud computing programs, and helps accelerate implementation of the new Earth Prediction Innovation Center, or EPIC for short. Congress authorized EPIC late last year to serve as a center of excellence to create an agile, focused, and measurable approach to community involvement in improving weather forecasting. The center will create a community global weather research modeling system that is publicly available to encourage collaboration. It will also strengthen NOAA's ability to undertake innovative research projects. Importantly, EPIC has an opportunity to continue breaking down barriers by accelerating the transfer of research to operations and operations to research, which will improve our weather forecasting enterprise. Improving these capabilities will help everyone across the country, and I urge all my colleagues to support my amendment. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member seek the time in opposition? Seeing none, the gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
I yield to my friend from New York, Mr. Serrano, 30 seconds.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
I rise in strong support of my friend from Colorado's amendment, which would increase funding to improve NOAA's weather forecasting abilities. This is an issue that we have to deal with. This is an issue that has to be dealt with in a proper way. This amendment does that, and as chairman of the subcommittee that oversees this section of the bill, I approve, and I hope my colleagues will vote for the amendment.
Thank you, gentlemen. And as there is no opposition, I'll close.
Question is recognized.
Thank you. I would urge the support for this amendment. I see my friend, Mr. Dunn, who's been in front of the Rules Committee half a dozen times on issues relating to this disaster relief bill and the impact that it's had on his state, Florida, all of Southeast United States. Throughout the Midwest, we've heard the gentlelady from Texas made a great case for this bill generally. So I urge support of my amendment, and I urge support of the overall disaster relief bill. We need it now, not later. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Does the gentlewoman request a recorded vote?
Yes.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does a gentlewoman from America Samoa seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Ms. Radwagen of American Samoa.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the red gentlewoman from American Samoa, Ms. Rattlewagon, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from American Samoa.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise for offering amendment and yield myself as much time as I consume.
The gentlewoman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise for the purpose of offering an amendment to provide an increase in American Samoa's nutrition assistance grant funding by $13 million in order to ensure food security for the American Samoan population due to damages sustained by Cyclone Gita in February 2018. Cyclone Gita's ravaging 100 miles per hour plus winds and torrential rains of over 30 inches devastated family farms and small farm businesses, farms that most American Samoans, for their immediate and extended families for subsistence purposes or to generate small business income. Cyclone Gita wiped out an entire growing season for the American Samoan farmer. But this is a hand up, not a handout, Madam Speaker. This emergency food aid, along with the additional Medicaid funding, federal matching support in this bill, will allow American Samoans to get back on their feet and fight for their community and country. It's what we do best. American Samoa has been the #1 Army recruiting station in America for 2 of the last 5 years and suffered the worst casualty rate in the Iraq War, both on a per capita basis. This bill will truly help our local veterans, soldiers, and their families, churches, and greater community get back to their fighting weight. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, for your leadership on nutritional assistance programs for so many years, and Ranking Member Cole and the Rules Committee members for listening to my testimony and providing this opportunity. Thank you, Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Granger, for your consideration, as well as thanks to Ag Subcommittee Chairman Bishop and Ranking Member Adderholt. And thank you to President Trump for swiftly declaring an emergency and FEMA for their response, and especially our Governor Lolo Molinga and his staff at home and in DC who have been so helpful on this request, and for his leadership on the recovery efforts. I ask again for your support for this emergency food assistance need for American Samoa. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields. Does any member seek the time in opposition?
I oppose time for the opposition, although I do support the amendment.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
On October 10th, 2018, my district took a direct hit from Hurricane Michael, one of the most powerful storms to make landfall in U.S. history. It slammed into the Florida Panhandle, drove through much of the Southeast, leaving a path of destruction all the way up to Virginia. In Georgia, many producers suffered nearly 100% crop losses. Michael killed more than 2 million chickens, devastated the Georgia cotton crop, which was nearing peak harvest. It was on track to be the best crop in years. This was the 3rd straight year hurricane damage caused significant losses to peanut, pecan, cotton, vegetable, landscaping, and the agritourism industries. The Carolinas also suffered billions in damages a month earlier from Hurricane Florence. Californians had another devastating fire season, including both the largest and deadliest fires on record. In Hawaii, volcanic activity caused pineapple farmers nearly $30 million in damages. Americans in the Mariana Islands and American Samoa were also hit by cyclones. To meet these needs, this House passed and sent to the Senate an emergency supplemental appropriations bill on January 16th that allocated $14 billion in emergency spending to help families and communities recover from these hurricanes, wildfires, and other natural disasters. Agriculture provided $3 billion in crop losses, $150 million for the Rural Community Facilities Program, $480 million for the Emergency Forest Restoration Program, $125 million for the Emergency Watershed Program. It provided $600 million in desperately needed funds to help with Puerto Rico's continued recovery from Hurricane Mariana in 2017. I thank my fellow Georgian, Austin Scott, and the bipartisan leadership, the House leadership, our committees, for quickly getting this bill passed. But as we passed it and sent it to the Senate, the Trump Office of Management and Budget issued a statement of administration policy saying that FEMA had enough money and this money was not needed. That could not be further from the truth. I disagree. Farmers and communities and all of the impacted states disagree, and even the USDA disagrees. The Emergency Supplemental Appropriations Bill has been stalled in the Senate for 4 long months with no action and no relief for Americans who are suffering. American farmers are living through the worst economic crisis in 30 years, driven by low commodity prices, trade war pressures, natural disasters. Those impacted have had their patience stretched to the end and cannot wait any longer for disaster assistance that they were promised. Right now, due to the disaster losses, farmers can't pay their operational loans from last year, nor can they get new loans to plant and operate this year. Planting season is now. We already are in the growing season when conditions permit normal growth. If we miss this window, it will have lasting effects on agricultural production, including food, fiber, building materials, and fuel that will increase costs for American consumers all over this country. We're about to enter the 2019 hurricane season, which starts June 1st. So today, I'm once again supporting this emergency supplemental bill as more disasters have hit since the last bill passed, the latest being terrible floods in the Midwest and tornadoes that ripped through Georgia and Alabama. This expanded supplemental bill will provide for the needs of those who suffered in those disasters, will add $3 billion and brings the appropriations total to $17.2 billion, which will cover all disasters and get much needed funds to those who were devastated and affected by Hurricane Michael. From coast to coast throughout the territories, there is an urgent need for this disaster bill. And as I said last October, after touring the damage from Hurricane Michael with the President, Vice President, Secretary of Agriculture, responding to natural disasters and helping our communities recover is a responsibility that we all share, regardless of ideology or political affiliation. Failure to respond now will result in failures later and suffering later throughout this country. So I urge my House and Senate colleagues to support this bill and to finally bring relief to our long-suffering communities. And I do support the gentlelady's amendment.
Yields, and the gentlewoman from America.
Am I done?
Does the gentlewoman from American Samoa seek unanimous consent to reclaim her time?
Do you want to speak more? Do you want to speak
No,
more?
I don't.
Nope.
No, Madam Speaker.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from American Samoa. Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, say no. And the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Sablon of Northern Mariana Islands.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands, Mr. Sablon, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Chair, in Congress, we depend on the expertise of federal agencies to tell us how much funding is needed by communities recovering from disaster. That was the case when the House passed H.R. 268 on January 16th. We set aside $10.4 million in that bill for water and sewer recovery for areas impacted by Super Typhoon U2. And we relied on the Environmental Protection Agency to verify that amount. But as happens in recovery situations, preliminary estimates were not completely accurate. When debris is removed, unseen damage is revealed. So in March, after the House passed H.R. 268, EPA revised its estimate of the cost for repairing sewer systems in the Marianas. But H.R. 2157, the bill now under consideration, has not taken the new March estimate from EPA into account. So H.R. 257 simply repeats what was in H.R. 268, the January bill. The amendment I'm offering instead relies on EPA's new updated assessment of the true rate, and I ask unanimous consent that EPA's estimate be added to the record.
The gentleman's request will be your general leave.
Thank you. EPA reports that funds will be needed to upgrade the Aguingan and Saduktosi wastewater treatment plants, quote, as a result of damage inflicted by Typhoon U2, end quote, and for lift stations and backup generators that were, again, quote, damaged by flooding and high winds, end quote. EPA says these projects cost $14 million. So my amendment takes into account the funding already in the base bill, however, and ask only for an increase of $8 million. Again, this requested increase is based on EPA's estimate, only available after passage of H.R. 268, the bill on which H.R. 2157 is based. I ask my colleagues for their support of my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Any member seek time in opposition?
Madam Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed to the amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I rise in support of Vice Chairman Sablan's amendment to provide much-needed emergency funding to repair the wastewater treatment plants devastated by Typhoon U2. I would like to thank the Vice Chairman for his leadership on disaster assistance and for securing a Medicaid hearing for the U.S. territories. The upcoming hearing will provide an opportunity for territory Medicaid issues to be brought to the forefront of Congress so that we can solve our access and funding issues, ensuring future equity and accountability for our Medicaid programs. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields.
Madam Chair, I have no further speakers, and so I ask for support of Sablan Amendment number 3 and the underlying bill, H.R. 2157. I thank my colleague and friend from American Samoa for her support of the bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands. Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands will be postponed. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purposes, gentlemen from Florida, seek recognition?
I would to address my amendment on military construction.
Will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Dunn of Florida.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I want to say thank you also to Congresswoman Granger. My amendment increases the military construction funding in the bill for the Air Force and the United States Marine Corps. Last year, Hurricanes Florence and Michael destroyed 2 of our nation's premier combat and training bases. Camp Lejeune in North Carolina sustained $3.6 billion in damages due to Hurricane Florence. Lejeune is critical to our nation's defenses, not only for the Marines, but also it is home to a major Navy command and a Coast Guard command. The base's unique access to 2 deep water ports allows for rapid seaborne deployments. It also has vast amounts of land and deep training resources. This is what makes Camp Lejeune the home of the Expeditionary Forces in readiness. Tyndall Air Force Base in my district in Florida took a direct hit from a Category 5 Hurricane Michael. Tyndall is home to the largest F-22 base in the world. It is one of only 2 Air Force bases that has immediate access to the Gulf Test and Training Range, a range that is like no other in the world. Our airmen are able to train and test on next-generation supersonic and hypersonic aircraft and weapon systems in a live-fire environment. A few months ago, President Trump came and he ordered the Air Force to make Tyndall a 5th-generation Air Force base outfitted with 3 squadrons of F-35s and a squadron of MQ-9s. This rebuild will cost $2.7 billion in military construction alone, and it will make Tyndall the base of the future. My amendment will raise MILCON funding in fiscal year 19 up to $500 million for the Marine Corps and up to $1 billion for the Air Force. This is only a down payment to help these services continue on their rebuild. This funding is crucial for our military. Our nation's defense is in crisis. Our readiness will continue to deteriorate if we do not provide the necessary funds to our armed services immediately. I'd like to make a couple of other points that sometimes seem to get lost in our discussions. The federal government knows that it self-insures the military. So from the moment the storms occurred, it was 100% certain that we were going to need a disaster supplemental. By law, the funds cannot come from FEMA. They cannot come from HUD. They must be directly appropriated by this Congress. Hurricane Michael was a unique storm. It was more like a tornado than a hurricane, but it was a tornado that was 80 miles wide and 120 miles deep. In my district, we have 3 million acres of land that is crushed. By way of comparison, in 2017, 3 hurricanes affected Florida: Hermine, Maria, and Irma. 50 counties were affected. Just the county that Tyndall Air Force Base sits in has already cleaned up 30 million cubic yards of debris, compared with less than 3 million in those 50 counties in 2017. Nobody in America, in the history of America, has ever seen this much debris. We estimate we are 20% of the way through our debris cleanup, 20%. And we've done more than anybody's ever seen in history. What are we going to do with these bases? Well, we're going to rebuild them. Of course, we're going to rebuild them. We love our military and we need our military. And I have never been more proud of any group than I have been of the airmen at Tyndall and the job that they've done to stand that base back up. They already have the 1st Air Force headquarters up and running, and that's air defense for all of North America. And we're ready to take back the F-22 training mission. I'm proud to say that the Tyndall has done a great job rebuilding, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member seek time in opposition?
Madam Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Florida seek the floor?
Madam Speaker, I rise to claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed to the gentleman's amendment.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I toured Tyndall Air Force Base a couple of months ago with Congressman Dunn, and I commend the gentleman for offering this amendment and have enjoyed working with him on making sure that we can prioritize this vital funding, and appreciate the ranking member and Chairwoman Lowy's support. Congressman Lawson also joined us in February to survey the devastating damage Tyndall sustained because of Hurricane Michael. It was very clear to me back in February that Tyndall urgently needs supplemental funds to rebuild. Tyndall Air Force Base, which is in my home state as well, encompasses 29,000 acres in southeastern Bay County. Within the base, facilities amount to a total plant replacement value of $3.48 billion. Tyndall accounts for 37% of Bay County's economy. The base serves a population of 3,393 active military personnel, as well as 9,383 retirees from all service branches. The supplemental before us contains $700 million for military construction Air Force, for planning and design and construction as requested by the Air Force to support relocation of F-22s, F-35 bed down, and facilities necessary to begin the rebuilding of the installation. That number is now outdated and must be increased to meet the Air Force's needs. The Dunn Amendment, plus what is currently included in the supplemental, is a good first step to helping Tyndall rebuild and get back on its feet. I'm also pleased the gentleman from Florida included funds for the Marine Corps. As all of us know, North Carolina was hit by Hurricane Florence, which devastated all of the Marine Corps facilities in North Carolina. The Marine Corps community continues to face daily challenges following Hurricane Florence. Although the storm made landfall on September 14, 2018, Marines at Camp Lejeune, Marine Corps Air Station New River, and Cherry Point are still recovering. Camp Lejeune, New River, and Cherry Point heavily contribute to Marine Corps readiness, and Camp Lejeune is home to the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, which oversees and maintains a third of the Marine Corps' combat operating power. Several headquarters, buildings, training facilities, and aircraft hangars were affected by Hurricane Florence. While 2MEF is now able to meet operational commitments, its training environments remain degraded. Currently, Marines are working in compromised facilities and temporary trailers. Furthermore, Marines headed to Camp Lejeune are being told to look for housing off base due to a lack of availability of on-base housing and substantial damage caused by the storm. Like the Air Force number, the Marine Corps number is also now outdated, and I support the $385 million increase to this account as well. The Trump administration, unfortunately, still has not submitted an emergency supplemental for these and other disasters. And frankly, these facilities need relief, and they need it now. It's been over 200 days since Hurricane Michael and Florence devastated North Carolina and Florida. It should not be taking this long to provide the necessary and vital funding to these locations. Stunningly, I want to repeat, the president has not even proposed emergency supplemental funding for these disasters, and this morning actually had the gall to urge Republicans to vote against this vital legislation. I urge all members to support the Dunn Amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves.
Chair, will the gentleman yield?
The gentleman from Florida is happy to yield 1 minute to my friend and colleague, Congresswoman Granger.
The gentleman only has 30 seconds remaining.
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. These funds are critical to repairing and rebuilding our military bases affected by the recent storms. I look forward to working with the gentleman to secure critical funding for our military in a final agreement that can be signed by the president. I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Madam Speaker, as a strong supporter of our armed forces, I fully support rebuilding of Tyndall Air Force Base and the North Carolina Marine Corps bases and urge members to support the Dunn Amendment, commend the gentleman for his advocacy for his community and for our home state, as well as the underlying legislation, so we can make sure that we can finally help these military communities rebuild. I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered from the gentleman from Florida. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does a gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Cunningham of South Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Cunningham, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
Madam Chair, my bipartisan amendment will allow the Air Force to repair and rebuild bases that were badly damaged by recent natural disasters and will restore funding for critical projects aboard the Nuclear Power Training Unit at Joint Base Charleston. Without the additional $270 million my amendment provides, the Air Force has stated that they will need to divert funding from projects across the country to rebuild Tyndall and Offutt Air Force bases. This would have disastrous effects on the readiness of our armed forces and on our national security. The operational success of our Navy is dependent on highly trained crews. The NPTU uses real nuclear power plants aboard retired submarines to train sailors to operate and maintain nuclear-powered fleet. And starting this month, the Low Country will be the only place in the nation where sailors can learn these highly technical skills, which are fundamental to our Navy's ability to maintain its worldwide presence and ensure the security of the global commons. That is why it is urgent that we pass this amendment and ensure the NPTU has the resources to modernize and repair its training facilities and ensure that the pipeline of newly trained nuclear operators is not disrupted. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina reserves his time. Is there a member that seeks time in opposition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana seek the floor?
Claim the time in opposition, although I do not oppose the amendment.
Without objection.
Madam Chair, I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. We are still waiting for a final damage assessment, and we understand that the Air Force has adjusted its original fiscal assessment. The underlying bill includes $400 million for the airport. The Cunningham amendment will increase the amount to a total of $670. The need for additional funding is acute. I have two of my colleagues who will also speak on that need. I would simply point out that I deeply regret at this late date that the administration still has not made official requests to fund the needs of both the Air Force and the Marines in the recovery from the last fall's hurricane. Absent a comprehensive request, the funds necessary to address the extensive damage for these key installations will be provided in an inefficient and piecemeal fashion. I would urge the administration, and particularly the Office of Management and Budget and the Secretary of Defense, to finally send a full and detailed cost assessment to Congress and properly prioritize the rebuilding of these installations. I would be happy to recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, our colleague, Mr. Corberry.
For how much time does the gentleman yield?
1.5 minutes, as I understand.
That would be helpful.
Please.
The gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me thank Chairman Bisklosky for the time and for his efforts here, as well as the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Cunningham, for offering this very important amendment to the bill. Madam Chair, it's pretty jarring when you stand in your district at a major piece of America's military infrastructure, Offutt Air Force Base, and it's a third underwater. Offutt Air Force Base is also home to Strategic Command, which is the command that is in charge of our nuclear enterprise here and around the world. In March of this year, a furious slurry of soil and water and ice rushed down the Platte and Elkhorn rivers. It crossed over the Missouri, hit the Iowa levee, blew it out, dug a 62-foot hole, and then water began to come back up the Missouri River. Offutt Air Force Base sits at the confluence of the Platte and Missouri rivers, and this is what forced the flooding. I'm very grateful again to my colleagues for recognizing that this is a disaster that needs national attention, along with the other natural disasters that have hit our country, particularly Tyndall Air Force Base as well. This amendment provides the funds to the Air Force operations and maintenance accounts to rebuild essential military infrastructure in my district and around the country. It will help us rebuild hangars and other buildings at Offutt, and this is in dire need. I'm pleased that my colleagues have recognized that this package, $120 million of which could potentially go to Offutt, is also essential for helping our nation rebound from the various natural disasters that have hit us. I yield back.
And I would be happy at this time to yield the balance of my time to Mr. Bacon from Nebraska.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the bipartisan work here to support our bases that need to be rebuilt. Now, I rise in support of this amendment to increase the Air Force O&M budget in the disaster aid package to a total of $670 million for recovery of the military bases that sustained extensive damage by the recent storms. In March, my district in the home state of Nebraska experienced devastating floods where lives were lost and the scale of destruction made it the worst natural disaster in our 152-year history as a state. The damage to Nebraska's infrastructure, agriculture, and local economy is extensive. It includes Offutt Air Force Base, one of the 2 largest employers in our local area. At the height of the storm, 1/3 of the base was underwater. 3,000 people were displaced from their work centers, and 1.2 million square feet of mission space was lost. The flight line was inoperable, with 1/3 of the runway underwater. Many structures incurred significant damage and critical systems were destroyed. Our nation owes a debt of gratitude to those men and women at Offutt that worked relentlessly to save what they could. The mission impact and cost to taxpayers would have been worse without their heroic efforts. So I'm very grateful for the bipartisan leadership here and the teamwork by Representatives Cunningham, Fortenberry, Dunn, and so many others to make this reality. Offutt's one of the 2 primary intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance hubs in our country, and it's the home of STRATCOM. So it's vital that we get this done. With that, I yield back, and I just thank you for yielding, and we need to support this amendment. Thank you.
And would yield back my time.
The gentleman yields. Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Dunn.
I thank you, Congressman
Gentleman is
Cunningham.
recognized for
Madam
1
Chair, I rise today because the United States Air Force is in desperate need of our help. I'm proud to co-sponsor this amendment that raises the Air Force funding levels for fiscal year 19. Our amendment, brings the operations and maintenance account up to $670 million, which is the minimum the Air Force needs to continue to rebuild Offutt and Tyndall Air Force bases. On October 10th, Tyndall in my district took a direct hit from Category 5 Michael. Now, 7 months later, no supplemental funding has been provided. That is irresponsible. On May 1st, Secretary Wilson was forced to halt all work rebuilding Tyndall due to lack of funds. This is a severe blow to our nation's military readiness. These bases are critical to our nation's defense for both combat and training missions, and some of the missions literally cannot be duplicated anywhere else in the world. Madam Chair, our ability to defend America is suffering. My district and many other districts across our nation are suffering from hurricanes, fires, and floods, and I urge a yes vote on the amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields, and the gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Madam Chair, I just want to thank my colleagues, Mr. Dunn, Mr. Fortenberry, and Mr. Bacon for their commitment to the men and women of our armed forces and for joining me in offering this bipartisan amendment. And I urge all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote in favor of this bipartisan common sense amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Huffman of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Madam Chair, I thank Chairwoman Lowy for her work on this disaster supplemental as well as her broader efforts to advance this disaster funding. It is unfortunate that our colleagues in the Senate have not yet acted to deliver disaster relief to communities across the country. My amendment responds to the needs of communities who are rebuilding their highway infrastructure after disasters. I'm joined in these efforts by my colleagues Harley Ruda and Norma Torres from California. I thank them for their support. And I'd also like to thank the California State Association of Counties for their important work on this issue and support of this amendment. We need to send a clear message to the Federal Highway Administration. Congress expects FHWA to work with communities who are simply seeking reasonable extensions for the use of their emergency relief funding. Under current policy, the FHWA requires that when a road or highway suffers serious damage, The state or local agency receiving federal assistance must begin the construction project within 2 years of the disaster. And we all agree that federal money should get out the door as quickly as possible. But this well-intended policy allows for extensions if there are reasonable difficulties in moving toward construction. Sometimes it just takes longer than expected to scope a project, to finalize all the permits. In other cases, the scale of the disaster itself means that counties simply don't have the capacity to move all their projects to construction within 2 years, even though they're moving as quickly as they can and doing everything right. The problem is, in a recent decision, FHWA began denying a series of extension requests, including one in Humboldt County, in my district. My amendment would pause FHWA's ability to deny these extensions moving forward. And I hope this amendment gives FHWA the opportunity to correct course and to get back to working with communities who are trying to rebuild as quickly as they can. Communities across the country, especially those in California recovering from flood and fire, are now facing the possibility of paying back millions of dollars that they desperately need, adding insult to injury. How widespread is this problem? Well, statewide in California, FHWA denied 66 out of 73 projects requesting an extension. So we need some help. We need this amendment. This amendment will not address all the problems caused by FHWA's extension denials, but it gives them an opportunity to reconsider their decisions and make things right. As a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, I am committed to working with my colleagues to establish clear guidelines on how the FHWA should manage emergency relief funds going forward. But for now, I urge adoption of this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek the floor?
Madam Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to claim the time in opposition to this amendment, even though I'm not in fact opposed.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank the gentleman from California for introducing this amendment and highlighting the issue of the FHWA not granting extensions when they're needed and when they're justified. It's important to highlight the issue. And as chairman of the Transportation HUD Appropriations Subcommittee, I'm aware of the issue, aware of the delays that affect certain federal highway emergency relief projects in California. Now, the amendment as drafted would have no practical effect on the funds to administer the program because they're not provided in this particular bill. But I look forward to working with the gentleman in coordinating with the Appropriations Committee, with the Authorizing Committee, to address this issue in a tangible way. So I have no objection to the amendment and yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from California is now recognized.
I thank the gentleman from North Carolina, and unless any of the speakers in opposition have further comments, I am prepared to close and yield back.
The gentleman has the only time remaining.
Very good. Well, Madam Speaker, the purpose of this supplemental appropriations bill is to help communities rebuild from disasters. And my amendment simply ensures that we give communities reasonable time to rebuild and recover. We shouldn't be yanking the rug out from under them before they've gotten themselves back on their feet. And for that reason, I urge adoption of this amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered from the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment 7, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition? Madam Chair, I have an amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment.
C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Ms. Schreier of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Schreier, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I rise today to draw attention to an important issue that I hope we can begin to address. Research is at the core of our ever-changing agriculture industry, including in my district. Our farmers rely on research from land-grant universities like Washington State University to build resilience in the face of a changing climate, to manage pests and diseases, and to respond to drought stresses. As the #1 USDA research and expenditures university in the country, Washington State University's work helps farmers in my district expand new varieties of economic powerhouse crops like pears, cherries, wine grapes, apples, potatoes, and hops. Prior to the recent Farm Bill signed into law last December, the USDA could exempt nonprofits and land-grant universities like Washington State University from a requirement that Specialty Crop Research Initiative grant recipients match the federal government dollar for dollar. It is really important to note that this waiver authority for matching requirements is available to every other ag research program in the Farm Bill except specialty crop research. During consideration of the recently passed Farm Bill, a Senate-originated provision that dropped the exemption was included. This will have devastating impacts on agriculture in my district and around the country. Washington is the second most agriculturally diverse state in the nation, growing everything from potatoes to peppermint, apples to azaleas, and wine grapes to barley and wheat. Washington State University partners with the USDA to make the state of Washington one of the largest and most successful agriculture enterprises in the world. From the beginning, Washington farmers, WSU, Washington State Department of Agriculture, and the USDA have joined forces to improve the productivity, efficiency, and safety of products coming from our state's fields and pastures. For example, in 2018, WSU received more than $5 million in funding to research pests threatening grapes, onions, garlic, and other specialty crops. This important research, which supports our state's diverse agricultural economy, would be jeopardized under the matching requirement authorized last year. This bipartisan amendment would underscore congressional support for vital public research like the work at Washington State University. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Does any member seek time in opposition? For what
I'd like to
purpose does the
claim time
gentleman
in
from Georgia
opposition.
seek recognition?
I'd like to claim time in opposition, although I support the amendment.
Objection. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I understand that this sudden reversal in the program was disconcerting for many of the universities and researchers that have received funding in the past and hope to do so in the future. Based on that, I have no objection to this amendment, and I fully support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
And yields back.
Thank you. Unless any of my colleagues rise in opposition, I am also prepared to close and yield back my time.
The gentlewoman has the only time remaining.
Thank you. In summary, I would like to encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. It will fund research throughout the country and end a process that is unfair to specialty crop farmers. Thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered from the gentlewoman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 8, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk and ask for its consideration.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mrs. Fletcher of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Fletcher, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume. As I stand here this morning, my district and the entire Houston region are underwater again. A severe rainstorm swept across the Houston area last night. Our bayous, creeks, and tributaries are at or over their banks. Rivers are cresting near record levels and may surpass them before the weekend is over. Nearly 90,000 residents have gone without power, and many are trapped by floodwaters. Parts of our area had up to 7 inches of rainfall within just a few hours last night, and it is still raining. It's the worst rainfall we've had since Hurricane Harvey. And last night, I heard from my constituents that it felt like Harvey and that they were afraid. As members of this body will recall, Hurricane Harvey hit Houston and the Gulf Coast in August of 2017. It dumped nearly 60 inches of rain, it claimed 68 lives, and it caused an estimated $125 billion in damages. It was the second most expensive hurricane in United States history. Members of this body responded to Harvey's devastation. In February of 2018, this body appropriated more than $4 billion to Texas through the Department of Housing and Urban Development Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Funds, explicitly to rebuild and mitigate against future storms. Storms like the one we are having right now. But nearly a year and a half after those appropriations were made, those funds have not arrived. Why? Because the Department of Housing and Urban Development has not published the rule governing the fund's use in the Federal Register. Most recently, HUD told our state agencies that the rules were set to publish on May 1st of this year. But again, the day has come and gone, and all we have is silence. This is unconscionable. It is for this reason that I offer this amendment today. My amendment requires the publication of the rule governing the 2017 CDBG-DR funds released within 14 days. And I am joined in this amendment by my Republican colleagues as co-sponsors. And I'd like to thank Mr. Graves and Mr. Rouser for co-sponsoring this truly bipartisan amendment. I know they've worked tirelessly on these issues for a while, and I appreciate their partnership on this issue. I also thank my colleague and co-sponsor from Houston, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, to whom I now yield 1 minute.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Allow me to thank my very important sponsor of this amendment, and as well our Republican colleagues for their leadership. We are underwater in Houston. We are concerned about Puerto Rico and support the underlying bill. But if this amendment passes, we will be able to help all of those who have impacted by disaster. 203,000 homes, 12,700 were destroyed. $4 billion is important dollars, and to have that delay really hinders those who are suffering now. You can imagine that we'll be going home to overflowing bayous and homes and people that are in fear. Therefore, this amendment, particularly in the shortening of the time, recognizes that disasters means emergencies, and people in emergencies are desperate and they need help. So I'm delighted to support this amendment, and will join with the gentlelady as we move forward on improving how FEMA responds as well to these disasters and how we can work further with the Army Corps of Engineers. But this important amendment is going to be a lifesaver for so many by shortening the time of which these regulations will be able to be rendered. And I thank the gentlelady for yielding and her leadership. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. Is there any member that would like to rise in opposition?
Madam Chair, I'd like to. I claim time for opposition, although I'm not
The gentleman
opposed.
from Texas.
I yield 1 minute to the Minority Leader, Mr. McCarthy.
Does the gentlewoman claim the time in opposition?
Yes. Just say yes. Say yes. Say yes.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes. The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank Congresswoman Kay Granger for yielding the time, and I thank the gentlelady for offering this amendment. You will see me vote for this amendment. Madam Chair, I rise to ask a simple question to this body. What is our mission? Are we here to make positive change to our fellow Americans, to solve problems, to respond to times of hardship? Or are we here to message? I would say collectively together, the answer should be we're here to make the change to help those in hardship. These are the moments in time when people do not ask if you're a Republican or Democrat. When Houston was flooded, I was down there that week, touring with members from both sides of the aisle, and nobody was arguing from either way. When Puerto Rico was hit, it was then, as I was the majority leader, and Congressman Steny Hoyer at the time was the whip, now the majority leader, we put a codel together with Republicans and Democrats. We just didn't go to the Keys, we went to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands together to work to help to make sure we rebuilt. When California had the devastating fires, one of the worst we've ever seen, I flew with the president. When we landed, we were met by the governor of California and the governor-elect. Not only did we tour together and of different parties, we talked about how to rebuild. We flew down because California has more than just one devastation and one fire. And we talked, we bonded in the basis of how we would work together. That is what America expects. The bill that we'll have on the floor today does not meet the criteria of both of us working together. And that's just not right. But yesterday, with the work of Congresswoman Kay Granger and the others in Appropriations Committee, we put together one and working with the Senate Republicans on appropriations and made an offer to the Democratic side. And I want to publicly make that to everyone. I know we can do better, and I know we can solve this. Made a commitment to the Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer. Let's work together and be right back here next week and get this solved. This has gone on too long, too much hardship, and we could rise to the occasion. The information I've gotten back from the Majority Leader is yes, he wants to work with us. Yes, they want to move this bill today, but I don't want to move a bill for sake of saying I moved a bill. I want to make law and help those in need. I've spoken to the President, I've spoken to the leader on the Senate side. I believe we can solve this all by next week. So today, when this vote is done and the messages are given, let's not stop. Let's put our committee together. Let's work through this weekend and the beginning of next week. And I know the very best of us will rise to this occasion. And we could be right back here, not with a debate of partisanship, not with a vote that defines pretty close to how we're registered inside this floor, but one united vote that will become law that the President will seek to sign. We know the outcome of the bill that we will vote on today. The President said he's not going to sign it. People are hurting. He wants to solve those problems too. We want to make sure even the money that we've already voted on delivered, that it gets delivered to the areas that need it the most. We want to make sure that we make the corrections, that the fires and the floods will not come back as severe as they were before from any ability that we have to do to stop that. I will make this pledge to everyone in this house. All partisanship aside, let's do this together. Let's show America that when it comes to a time of need, that we all put partisanship aside, that we put people before politics. So yes, carry on the vote today, but I'm not going to be voting for it. But I want you to know where my heart is. We will be back here next week, and we will make law, and we will solve this. Just as the offer went across the aisle, I know we can do better. I yield back.
The gentleman yields.
I yield back the balance of my time to Mr. Price.
I thank my
The gentleman
colleague,
from North Carolina is recognized.
Madam Chair, I thank my colleague for yielding. I do want to speak in strong support of this amendment, which may well be the most important amendment to be offered this morning. I certainly think that with respect to my home state of North Carolina, where thousands of residents are eagerly awaiting the issue of the Federal Register notice, which this amendment references. This notice will unlock billions of dollars, CDBG disaster mitigation funds, to rebuild communities in North Carolina, Texas, Florida, South Carolina, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Georgia, and other locations. Now, to be clear, while the underlying bill addresses the damage from Hurricane Florence, which hit North Carolina last September, this Federal Register notice we're discussing addresses damage from Hurricane Matthew, from other storms, 2016, 2017 disasters, where we're still awaiting relief and recovery. Secretary Carson promised during our subcommittee hearing last month that the notice we're talking about today would be released on May 1. And as far as HUD was concerned, that was achieved. But now it's OMB. It's the White House. They've prevented this notice from being released. This so-called review appears to be a change in practice. That is not acceptable. North Carolina residents have endured 2 hurricanes in the past 3 years. They and other storm victims around this country should not have to endure more stalling, more slow walking from President Trump. This amendment sends a message that Congress is tired of the administration's delays and that we're serious about helping communities in need. So I couldn't more strongly support this amendment. I commend our colleague and the bipartisan group who have offered it, urge support of the amendment.
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Granger, is recognized.
I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields. A woman from Texas, Ms. Fletcher, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank my co-sponsors and my colleagues for their support of this amendment. I agree. The time for action is now, and for the reasons that we have set forth, I urge all of my colleagues to vote in favor of this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
The question is on the amendment offered from the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Fletcher. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Chair, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, the further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 9, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 9, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Ms. Axney of Iowa.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney.
Madam Chair, it's been almost 2 months since severe flooding devastated communities in southwest Iowa and our neighbors in Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. Entire towns were underwater, homes were destroyed, family farms are devastated, and small businesses are facing irreparable damage. Many local schools may be forced to permanently close their doors. I've been down to the flood zones multiple times to speak with farmers, homeowners, and business owners who've lost everything. Their resilience is inspiring, but the damage is heartbreaking. When I helped Lizzie Young and her family muck out their house, I saw firsthand how desperately Iowans need that disaster relief. David Luth, a farmer from Percival, has been kayaking out to his farm fields to assess and repair his damage. Fran Mirzwa, a Pacific Junction resident whose home remained underwater for weeks, has been helping repair large city water pumps to move water pumps out of the flooded area. And in Hamburg, Grape Community Hospital, the only rural hospital in the area, had to bring in military-operated water tanks just to keep its doors open to provide basic services. And true to who Iowans are, they're now providing space to local businesses inside the hospital so that those businesses don't have to leave the area. We want to keep people in our state. School district superintendents in Mills and Fremont counties are locating displaced students to provide them with transportation and meals so they can keep coming to school on a daily basis. Iowans need our help. My amendment today increases funding for programs that are crucial to helping Iowans and our neighbors rebuild and recover. My amendment will increase funding for the Emergency Watershed Program, which is desperately needed for the Midwest to recover. The Emergency Watershed Program helps communities quickly address serious damages to infrastructure and land and fix imminent hazards to life and property caused by natural disasters. From my firsthand experiences in the flooded areas, I can attest to the serious damage and hazards that these communities face. The USDA had to release a new estimate in April for funding for the Emergency Watershed Protection Program due to the Midwest floods. Instead of the $125 million that was the prior estimate, the USDA has now estimated they'll need $435 million. So my amendment of $310 million makes sure the USDA has enough money to help the Midwest. Without this funding increase, the USDA might not otherwise be able to ensure Iowans and our neighbors get the help that they deserve. The Emergency Watershed Program funding will be used to remove debris from streams, roads, and bridges. It will help repair eroded river and stream banks, and it can be used to repair damaged and destroyed draining facilities in communities like Hamburg. This funding can be used to repair the more than 40 levees that breached during the flooding, and those that didn't break suffered erosion damage from overspill over those that are still standing. But experts believe that it could take years to repair all the damage. Iowans don't have that time to wait, and the National Weather Service shows the Midwest will remain vulnerable to flooding all spring and summer, and rivers are expected to stay high. This federal aid is vital to rebuilding Iowa communities. The Iowa governor believes we sustained almost $1.6 billion in damages, and early estimates also indicate that at least $214 million in agriculture-specific damages. And we still don't know the true extent of our agriculture losses yet. We can't afford to wait. We can't let partisan politics stall this crucial bill, and we must not turn our backs on our communities when they're recovering from devastating damages of natural disasters. That's not who we are as Iowans, and that's not who we are as Americans. I call on my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and in the House and the Senate to get together and work for hardworking Americans. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. Is there any member that seeks time in opposition?
Madam
For what
Speaker,
purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek the floor?
I claim time in opposition, although I support the amendment.
Without objection.
Until the Midwest flood struck, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was fairly confident that the Emergency Watershed Protection Program needs were fully met with the $125 million that was in the bill. However, on April 25th, USDA advised us that the estimate had increased to $435 million, with large funding needs in Iowa and in Nebraska in particular. This amendment would bring the bill to that level. And so I'm therefore happy to support the amendment. And at this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry, the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Agriculture Appropriations.
The gentleman yields, and the gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to first recognize and thank my good friend, the chair of the Ag Appropriations Committee, my leader, Mr. Bishop from Georgia, for yielding the time. I also want to thank my colleague, Representative Axney from Iowa, for working in partnership together on this important amendment. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, this is tough stuff. This was one of the most destructive weather events in our lifetimes. It was a perfect storm of factors that enabled and caused the dislocation and distress across many states and multiple communities where I live. In Nebraska and in Iowa, lands that were soaked by autumn rains were frozen solid. Then they were covered in snow. Then this bomb cyclone hit us with a lethal mix of blizzard and rain, an enormous quantity of water and ice and collected topsoil. It all sped down our rivers and creeks and reservoirs, bursting through dams and levees and other structures designed to hold the torrent back. As I said in our previous debate, it's pretty jarring to stand on a ridge and look at an Air Force base 1/3 underwater, which again sits at the confluence of the Missouri and Platte rivers overlooking Iowa in Nebraska. The Corps of Engineers said to me, our levee system looks like Swiss cheese. Now, Madam Chair, while our Midwest constituents are known for their hardiness, individuals in our communities, we can't solve the problem alone through just state or local resources. We need to partner with the federal government to repair badly damaged watersheds, so vital to our nation's environmental security. The amendment adds $310 million to the $125 in the bill. Approximately 60% of the funds will go to the damage caused in the Midwest floods, as well as communities impacted by Hurricane Florence, Harvey, and Michael. On the ground, Madam Chair, in both of our states, this program will help restore the scarred lands. This important relief will repair and reshape eroded stream banks, repair water control structures, repair levees, and restore conservation priorities. Our communities are getting back on their feet, but we need this program quickly to address serious and long-term damages to the infrastructure and our land. Thank my colleagues for their consideration. I yield back.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis, 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I rise today in support of this amendment to H.R. 2157, increasing funding for the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. Last year, Utah, like many states in the West, faced devastating wildfires that affected areas of my district. The Pole Creek Fire and Bald Mountain Fire, which started on federal land, collectively burned over 117,000 acres and left damaged infrastructure and watersheds. Many of my communities affected by the fires need assistance to rebuild and repair the critical watersheds that they rely on, but they have not been able to receive it. For example, Utah County has been approved for over $9 million in aid from NRCS through this program, but inadequate funding means they won't receive those promised dollars. Cleaning up and rebuilding after a wildfire is an important step in protecting against future disasters. I'm pleased to support this amendment that will bring aid to communities like Utah County that have been affected by catastrophic natural disasters. And with that, Chairman, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. The gentleman from Georgia
I yield back
is
the balance
recognized.
of my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney. Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 10, printed in Part C of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Iowa seek the floor?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 10, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mrs. Axney of Iowa.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Iowa.
Madam Chair, my amendment to increase funding for the Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief Program. As we've just discussed, I've toured the flood zones in my district, and I've experienced firsthand how badly the floodwaters have eroded and impacted our roads. The flooding was so severe that as of only this just past Wednesday of this week, did our major interstate, I-29, finally fully reopen, and this comes nearly 2 months after the flooding began. The closing of I-29 cut off the major north-south artery in Iowa that connects the Omaha Council Bluffs area to Kansas City. Drivers are forced to travel hours out of their way and find smaller 2-lane roads and highways to get to where they need to be. The resulting truck and traffic damage on our secondary roads is already apparent. Residents have suffered as traffic has suddenly doubled and tripled, and we still have roads that aren't open yet. Mr. and Mrs. Patel, motel owners in Fremont County, are dependent on I-29 being open and traffic coming through the area to keep their business open, and that's not going to happen without functional roads. If our roads remain closed, children can't get to school, community members cannot patron local businesses, and grandchildren can't spend time with their grandparents. The Federal Highway Administration Emergency Relief Program will help Iowa address our immediate highway repair needs, restore traffic, and help restore our facilities. Safe and functional roadways are some of the most critical infrastructure in any community, let alone one trying to recover from a disaster. And this type of federal aid is vital to rebuilding Iowa communities in need. Initial estimates from our governor show we sustained over $1.6 billion in damages, and that number is growing. And programs like this one mean that Iowa and Nebraska can focus on repairing our local roads and ensure the federal government does its part in paying for those roads. I call on my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and in the House and the Senate to get to work helping hardworking Americans, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from Iowa reserves her time. Is there a member that seeks time in opposition?
Madam Chair, I ask
For what
unanimous,
purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to claim the time in opposition, although in fact I do support the amendment.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, the Federal Highway Administration's latest estimate for the Emergency Relief Program identified $1.3 billion in projects in disaster-affected areas. This bill actually contains something more than that, $1.65 billion, but the FHWA estimates do not yet account for the damage from the Midwest floods. So this amendment would rectify that. It would provide the FHWA with additional resources to address the damage from the flooding in Iowa, in other affected states, and then any excess funds would remain available for future disasters. So I thank our colleague for offering this amendment. I think it's needed, and I support its adoption. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields, and the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Iowa, Representative Axtee.
I just want to close by thanking my colleagues across the aisle, and in particular, Representative Fortenberry and Mr. Curtis for helping out all these people in need, not just in our communities in Iowa, but across the country. I'm looking forward to passing this disaster bill today so we can get this immediate relief out to folks across this country, including those in my own backyard. And I'm grateful for all the work that's been done by the Chair of Appropriations and the subcommittee chair, Sanford Bishop, to help us get where we needed to be on this. And I'm looking forward to going back to Iowa, letting them know that we've got the funding necessary to help them repair their lives. I yield the balance of my time.
The question is on the amendment offered from the gentlewoman from Iowa. Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part C of House Report 11651, on which further proceedings were postponed, in the following order. Amendment number 1 by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado. Amendment number 3 by Mr. Sablon of the Northern Mariana Islands. Amendment number 6 by Mr. Huffman of California. And amendment number 8 by Ms. Fletcher of Texas. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business in the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 1, printed in Part C of House Report 11651 by the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part C of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Perlmutter of Colorado.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. Sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
So, a fairly brief legislative session on this Friday as members have been considering just over $17 billion in supplemental disaster aid to address damage from wildfires, hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, typhoons, and other natural disasters. General debate on this bill happened yesterday. Votes here are on amendments to the bill, beginning with this particular amendment offered by Congressman Perlmutter of Colorado. This amendment would seek an additional $5 million for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to improve hurricane intensity forecasting, flood prediction and mitigation, and wildfire detection. We are also expecting a vote on a procedural motion to make changes to the bill and a possible vote on final passage. So while members work through this list of amendments, recently we talked with a Capitol Hill reporter who's been watching this debate on this supplemental.
Kelly Madrick is an appropriations and budget reporter for CQ Roll Call, and she joins us for details on the disaster relief bill in the House. Kelly, what are some of the key details in the revised version, this $17.4 billion bill, and why is it being brought up again?
So remember, the House passed a version that was $3 billion less in January. Since then, because of ongoing disagreements between members of the Senate, really, once after the House passed that original bill in January, the Senate ran into a bunch of disagreement over funding for the island territory of Puerto Rico. So now the House is kind of taking another crack at the measure. There's been a lot of extra storm damage that's kind of happened in the interim that they're addressing with this additional $3 billion. About 1.5 of that goes to flood control projects with the Army Corps. About $1 billion goes to the Department of Housing and Urban Development for what's known as community development block grant funding. It's basically really flexible grants to local governments to repair anything from, a broken water system to, helping with local community facilities, for example, or something like that. And then another $500 million to the Department of Agriculture for basically farm rehabilitation. Farm country has gotten hit really hard, especially with the influx of, Midwest flooding and some other types of weather events we've seen recently. So they've kicked up the price tag to what's now $17.4 billion.
And then you mentioned the Senate, but then even in the House back in January, only 6 House Republicans voted for the package then. What are you hearing from leadership and from members now about their support for this new version?
House Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma, a leadership Republican, indicated that he was likely to support the bill in the House Rules Committee earlier this week. But at the same time, a limitation on funding for constructing President Donald Trump's, highly desired border wall between the U.S. and Mexico has been a key limitation in Congress being able to pass this legislation. The new bill also blocks funding for the border wall, although it doesn't contain very much immigration-related provisions that are as obvious as the previous iteration of the bill. Just as was seen on the House floor with the motion to recommit, where House Republicans wanted to add the president's recent $4.5 billion supplemental request related to border security. He wants more money for the Office of Refugee Resettlement due to, having to house more migrants and a bunch of other provisions. They tried to insert that into the bill using a procedural maneuver. They failed this Thursday. So, it's going to become a broader problem of how lawmakers can thread this needle on the border issue. I'm expecting that there will be wide Democratic support for it and some Republicans as well, because if you think about it, Republicans from Florida, for example, who are suffering, and a lot of their constituents are suffering, still trying to repair from hurricane damage, it would be a very hard vote to vote against $17 billion in disaster funding, even if it doesn't contain certain provisions that they want related to the border. So, it seems to be a strong vote, but I don't know how strongly bipartisan it will be, especially given that there's continuing disagreement on some of the core issues in a separate debate in the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the bill was introduced in the House by the Appropriations Committee Chair, Nita Lowey of New York. And there are several amendments, including one from her that you describe as a self-executing amendment. What does that mean? And then what would it do to this bill?
Yeah, I try to explain this simply as like a bit of procedural magic on the House floor that's ushered in by the House Rules Committee. Essentially, once the House adopts the rule for consideration of the bill, that amendment from House Appropriations Chairwoman Nita Lowey of New York, as you said, it's self-executed, which means it's inserted directly into the text of the bill that's up for debate. So essentially, Lowey's amendment is pretty simple. It makes some technical corrections to the bill's extension of the National Flood Insurance Program, which currently would expire at the end of May without action from Congress. But those are just technical. Some of the more substantive things the amendment does is it provides $91 million for repairing federal buildings and other federal infrastructure from the Federal Buildings Fund. And it also kind of cracks open disaster eligibility when it comes to how a local government decides whether to repair or replace some type of damaged infrastructure or facilities. So once that amendment's added, again, that corresponds with the rule vote. Then they get into amendment debate. 10 amendments were made in order on debate. They're pretty non-controversial, but there are some interesting ones related to funding the military and other provisions related to housing improvements and those types of issues.
And Kelly, just finally swinging back to the Senate, the House working this week on the disaster bill, the Senate continuing talks on their end, and you write with your colleague Jennifer Schutt that the president's $4.5 billion border demand is really slowing the talks. Who are some of the key players involved in the negotiations and then the main issues that remain?
So, Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont, the top Democrat on the Appropriations Committee, Senator Shelby of Alabama, the chairman, they have been talking for weeks now on how to kind of thread this needle between the border issue, the Puerto Rico issue, and, some other issues that are even popping up just today. Just today, my colleague Jennifer reported on how Senator Shelby is finding issue with White House resistance to basically a budgetary carve-out for harbor maintenance. That's a very obscure provision, but it just kind of demonstrates how many kind of hanging, nagging things are remaining on this disaster debate. So, Senator Richard Shelby directly, pointed at the White House and said their opposition to this provision is holding things up. And when he talks about that, that's mainly White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, but other members of the Office of Management and Budget are probably, discussing and debating this with members as well. But then again, it's not just the border, it's not just Puerto Rico, it's not just like a harbor trust fund issue that's somewhat parochial to the chairman. Democrats kind of don't like that because they want to roll that into a transportation bill. There's all kinds of just like poking and prodding that's going on this legislation. And it seems that Congress has not had sufficient time to do that. So they're continuing to debate all these myriad provisions. I mean, my colleagues on CQ's team budget and I have all kind of experienced in the past few weeks, every day, kind of the reason why the disaster package isn't coming together changes, whether it's Puerto Rico, whether it's the border, or whether today, the latest one is that there's this scuttlebutt going on the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund.
Well, Kelly, we appreciate all the information. Continue to follow you on Twitter at KELMEJ, and you're reporting at CQ.com. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And President Trump tweeted his opposition to this supplemental yesterday, saying House Republicans should not vote for the bad Democrat disaster supplemental bill, which hurts our states, farmers, and border security. The president tweeted on the eve of the expected House votes, "We do want to do much better than this. All sides keep working and send a good bill for immediate signing," he added. And The Hill reporting today, should the measure pass the Democratic-led lower chamber, it would shift the focus to the GOP-led Senate, where lawmakers have struggled to reach an agreement on the stalled disaster aid package. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that he would like to see a bill pass before the Memorial Day recess, despite hurdles. Again, the House voting now on this list of 4 amendments to the disaster funding bill. We are expecting a vote on passage later this hour. Earlier today, House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff was interviewed by Mike Allen of Axios, where he talked about the Mueller report and the